We are going to be in Daniel this morning, Daniel chapter 1, 2, and 3, mainly focusing in 3, but we need 1 and 2 for the backdrop. So if you are familiar with that, we are getting to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which there's fire in it. So don't expect some fire and brimstone sermon today with the title, Bring on the Fire. I grew up in the church. My dad was a first-generation believer in his family, and it was just a couple years before I was born that he was saved. And so I grew up in the church. I remember going to youth group and going to a lot of youth group events. There was this one particular event called Dare to Share, and it had traveled all across the country, and there were skits and songs and teachings and a heavy emphasis on sharing the faith. I remember one particular story. The main speaker was telling a story of his brother, and his brother was riding a bike and had pulled up next to a car and the windows were down. And so it was just, the timing was perfect. So he went and started sharing the gospel with this car that had pulled up to a red light just because their windows were down. And the light turned green, and he wasn't done yet. So he just held onto the car as they started taking off. And the guy driving found it funny and went faster and faster and faster. And his brother just held onto his bike, trying not to fall as he was finishing off his sermon. And I remember being so inspired by that. And, you come from a weekend like that, and you send a bunch of middle schoolers and high schoolers to a weekend like that, and they come home invincible. All right, we are going to tell everybody we know about Jesus. And then you show up to school Monday morning wearing your Dare to Share shirt, wearing your Dare to Share wristband, with your Dare to Share bookmark and your Dare to Share Bible, and you're daring to share. And you see this one person, they're bad. They stay out past curfew. And you go to share the gospel with them. You're like, hey, Cody, because that's the name of a bad kid. Hey, Cody, how was your weekend? Cool, my weekend was fine. I didn't do anything. And you chicken out. And I just remember youth group, everything was so intense. Everything was so great. And we get up and, they ask you questions in youth group like, would you die for the gospel? And they tell you about martyrs. But then you get to school, and you have a hard time standing out. You have a hard time actually living out the little steps. You have a hard time being faithful in the small, everyday actions. So while Daniel chapter 3 is a big story, one of those big tests, I want to take a look at some background here. This is going to be kind of Bible heavy today. If you want to flip to Daniel in your Bible, we're going to be in the CSB today. Daniel chapter 1, I'm going to kind of go all over the place so we have a better understanding of what's going on here. Daniel chapter 1, 3 through 7. The king ordered Ashpenaz, I'm sure that's how you say it, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the Israelites from the royal family and from the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, good-looking, suitable for instruction in all wisdom, knowledgeable, perceptive, and capable of serving in the king's palace. He was to teach them the Chaldean language and literature. The king assigned them daily provisions from the royal food and from the wine that he drank. They were to be trained for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to attend the king. Among them from the Judites were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief eunuch gave them names. He gave the name Belshazzar to Daniel, Shadrach to Hananiah, Meshach to Mishael, and Abednego to Azariah. And in verse 17 through 20, God gave these 4 young men knowledge and understanding in every kind of literature and wisdom. Daniel understood visions and dreams of every kind. At the end of the time that the king had said to present them, the chief eunuch presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king interviewed them, and among all of them, no one was found equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they began to attend to the king. In every matter of wisdom and understanding the king consulted them about, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and mediums in his entire kingdom. So, if you've been with us in our Nehemiah study, you know that Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians came to Judah and took it over. They came in, they scattered the people amongst them, and obviously took some as slaves. And Daniel and his 3 friends are tasked with being faithful to God's law in a foreign country that is opposed to God's law. And in this, we see here that they don't eat of the king's food and that they remain faithful, and that even in their training by their captors, they remain faithful. And so in their 3 years of training, they remain faithful to God's law, and God blessed them for it. God grants them knowledge and understanding for their faithfulness. And these gifts were used to prosper the pagan king Nebuchadnezzar, which leads us into chapter 2, an example of that. Daniel 2, 1 through 6. In the 2nd year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams that troubled him, and sleep deserted him. So the king gave orders to summon the magicians, mediums, sorcerers, and Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. When they came and stood before the king, he said to them, I have had a dream and am anxious to understand it. The Chaldeans spoke to the king, May the king live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will give the interpretation. Verse 5, the king replied to the Chaldeans, My word is final. If you don't tell me the dream and its interpretation, you will be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be made a garbage dump. But if you make the dream and its interpretation known to me, you will receive gifts, a reward, and great honor from me. So make the dream and its interpretation known to me. And they couldn't. See, the king was smart. He knew that if he just told them the dream, they would make something up. He wanted truth. And if he could find somebody that could tell him the dream, he could believe what their interpretation was. In verse 17 through 19, then Daniel went to his house and told his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah about the matter, urging them to ask the God of the heavens for mercy concerning this mystery. So Daniel and his friends would not be destroyed with the rest of Babylon's wise men. The mystery was then revealed to Daniel in a vision at night, and Daniel praised the God of the heavens. So in this dream, Nebuchadnezzar sees this giant statue. Its head was golden, and then below that was silver, and below that was bronze, and below that was iron and clay, symbolizing the Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, and then eventually the Roman Empire. And the key part to this story, which Nebuchadnezzar so clearly forgets, the key part of the story is that there is a rock hewn by not a human hand, this alien rock that comes down and hits the statue. And this statue breaks up into pieces like chaff so that the wind blows away the pieces. It breaks up into such tiny pieces. And then there a mountain from the rock grows, a kingdom everlasting. And so then we see Nebuchadnezzar's response to Daniel in chapter 2, 46 through 49. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell face down, worshipped Daniel, and gave orders to present an offering and incense to him. The king said to Daniel, Your God is indeed God of gods, Lord of kings, and revealer of mysteries, since you were able to reveal this mystery. Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many generous gifts. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and chief governor over all the wise men of Babylon. At Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to manage the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained at the king's court. So all of his regular people could not determine this. All of the rulers, all of the wise men in his country could not determine this. And Daniel and his 3 friends, they pray. They remain faithful to God. Instead of trying to guess or lie or scheme a way out of the area, they pray to God and ask God to reveal the truth to them. And so they remain faithful. And God answers the prayers, and Daniel is able to tell and interpret the dream. King Nebuchadnezzar then puts Daniel in the number 2 spot in the kingdom. Now, we had talked about hyperlinks before in the Bible, and as soon as I read that Nebuchadnezzar had promoted Daniel, I immediately think back to Joseph in Egypt, and how he was promoted for being faithful through the entire time. And when I think of Joseph, I think of one last line that he says to his brothers: what you meant for evil, God meant for good. And so I know that theme is going to come out here. So things are looking pretty good right now for these 4 guys. They were taken into captivity. They were made servants, but they have been faithful, and God has been faithful in return. And so now, King Nebuchadnezzar, the greatest king in the land at this time, is really happy with them, real stoked, because he's the gold king. He's the best one. According to Daniel and according to his dream, he's going to be the best king that's ever lived. So he's super happy with these 4 guys, and they all get a great promotion. And it looks like smooth sailing from here on out for these guys. We'll see. Now we get to our main chapter here, which is Daniel chapter 3. So let's see how long this good thing lasts. Daniel 3, just the first part of verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue, 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. So it's a pretty big statue. So far, so good, though. You know, he's a pagan king. He likes that idea that he's going to be the gold king. And it makes sense for somebody who does not fully worship God to build up a statue of himself. Why not commemorate himself? And one thing that we notice here with Nebuchadnezzar is he does not build a statue in his dream. He builds a better statue, one that is not partially gold, but one that is entirely gold. So in his building of the statue, he is defying the interpretation. He is saying, no, my kingdom will last forever. And one thing I want to point out, he has every right to be all haughty at this point, to be prideful, because he has built an amazing kingdom. I looked up modern day or images of what Babylon looked like at the time. No other city was like it. A giant ziggurat. And then we also hear the 7 wonders of the ancient world, one of those being the Hanging Gardens that was built by Nebuchadnezzar. A man-made mountain of gardens. And so he is capable, for sure. And so this statue is clearly prideful and celebratory of his rule and not out of character at all. So far, everything's fine. Let's continue on in that verse. King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Uh-oh. So we talked about the Bible being hyperlinks. When we see Dura, we need to know where that is. The Bible rightly reminds us where we're at. We just had all these good things happen for these guys. Everything's great. They are in captivity, taken away from the promised land. The kingdom of God is, for all intents and purposes, destroyed at this point. They have no hope for their place being rebuilt back up. And so the Bible reminds us again of where we are at. Dura is in the plain of Shinar, and lots of bad things happened here. We have the Tower of Babel. That was a pretty big bad thing, where the people decided to rebel against God and try to build a tower of their own up to heaven so they could dethrone God. Even Abraham, the father of the faith, fought a king from that area to get his nephew Lot back. And we also have the captivity of Judah here. And the Bible would continue on in prophecies. The future Antichrist and bad things will happen here, figuratively or not. So when the Bible reminds the reader of this location, we are supposed to be jolted out of the comfort zone that these 4 people are in and reminded and brought back to the reality of the evil world that they are in, that they are indeed under captivity. And so the story goes on. Instead of being built up in the first 2 chapters, we now see their fall. In Daniel 3, 2 through 4, King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to assemble the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to attend the dedication of the statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces assembled for the dedication of the statue the king had set up. They stood before the statue Nebuchadnezzar had set up A herald loudly proclaimed, "People of every nation and language." We need to pause again right here. Another hyperlink. It's another uh-oh. This is the place of the Tower of Babel. Nebuchadnezzar would remember that story, and certainly Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would remember this story. This is where all peoples came together to build a tower to dethrone God, and they all spoke one language. And so God split these people up into different languages, and we know from Daniel 1 that Nebuchadnezzar is training all these people in the Chaldean language. He's trying to rebuild what was once there. And that starts with him being worshiped. Not just humanity coming together for a common goal, but humanity coming together to worship Nebuchadnezzar. Instead of humanity replacing God, Nebuchadnezzar wants to replace God himself. He's trying to have his kingdom last forever. And that starts with everybody bowing down to him. So let's continue. Daniel 3, 5 through 7. When you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, drum, and every kind of music, you are to fall face down and worship the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. But whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. Therefore, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and every kind of music, people of every nation and language fell down and worshipped the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. The Bible wants us to stop here and ask a question. It said every people from every nation and language fell down and worshipped. What about Daniel? What about Hananiah? What about Mishael? What about Azariah? The Bible wants us to ask, did they bow down? And then while we're at it, would we bow down? Every one of us here can think back to a time, whether it was in high school, whether it was at work, whether it was in our family, that we should have stood up and done the righteous thing and been faithful to God. Every single one of us can think of a time now. And every single one of us can think of one where we didn't, where we let cowardice affect us. Maybe it was your non-Christian friend at school that was being bullied, and you stood by, or worse, participated in it, thinking, oh, it's just jokes, it's fine. Maybe it was your sleazy boss making crude and anti-Christian comments while you half chuckle because you know there's a promotion coming up and you don't want to be seen as the stuffy Christian. Maybe it's through your grown kids. With their independence, they are choosing sin and disobedience to God, and you don't want to risk ruining your relationship with them. After all, they're adults. You can't tell them what to do. Now, if we are unfaithful in the little things, as the years slip on, we will continue these habits. Till soon, your non-Christian friend is no longer your friend. In fact, he hates all Christians, all those hypocrites. As we fail to practice holiness, your boss and all your coworkers see no difference between you and them. And so when they have a life crisis, you have no standing to share the gospel. After all, you're no different. And as we fail to stand up for righteousness, eventually our kids will come over for family meals and bow their heads in prayer, not out of respect for God, but out of respect for you. They certainly don't do it at home, and they rarely take your grandkids to church. Eventually, your great-grandkids won't even know the name of Jesus, and your legacy will be pagan and not Christian. And this is the consequence of not being faithful in every little thing in our life. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah had the option to bow down and get past this one little ugly part in their life. After all, they just had a promotion. Why rock the boat right now? There's nothing they can do. Their people are destroyed. They're no military match for Babylon. They didn't have to stand out. They didn't have to follow God, but that was against their character. Now, if you had not heard this story before, what would you guess they would do? Would you assume that these followers of God would bow down to the statue? After hearing their faithfulness in law in chapter 1 and prayer in chapter 2, would you guess that they would bow down? If you had not heard this story before, would you guess that they would stand firm on the foundation that God has already built in them? So let's see what happens. Daniel 3, verse 8 through 12. Some Chaldeans took this occasion to come forward and maliciously accuse the Jews. The literal translation there is take bites at the Jews. So we have this imagery of jackals in a desert, seeing maybe an injured antelope, picking at it, biting at it, slowly taking it down. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. You as king have issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, drum, and every kind of music must fall down and worship the gold statue. Whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. There are some Jews you have appointed to manage the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men have ignored you, the king. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up." The Bible wants us to pause again here. What do you think Nebuchadnezzar is going to do? Let's look back at his character. Daniel 1, verse 10. Speaking of the eunuch taking care of Daniel and his 3 friends, when asked if they could have a different diet, he says, "I fear my lord the king, who assigned you your food and drink. What if he sees your faces looking thinner than the other young men at your age? You would endanger my life with the king?" Daniel 2:5, the king replied to the Chaldeans, "My word is final. If you don't tell me the dream and its interpretation, you will be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be made a garbage dump." Daniel 2:12, because of this, the king became violently angry and gave orders to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. And then just before, in 3:6, but whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. So, do you think Nebuchadnezzar will have a change of heart? Do you think he'll say, "Live and let live"? Or do you think he will act in accordance with his previous actions and character already revealed? Daniel continues the story. Verse 13. Then, in a furious rage, Nebuchadnezzar gave orders to bring in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar asked them, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is it true that you don't serve my gods or worship the gold statue I have set up?" And without allowing them to respond, now if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, drum, and every kind of music, fall down and worship the statue I made. But if you don't worship, you will immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God who can rescue you from my power? So it sounds like Nebuchadnezzar will keep on the same path of anger and violence. Notice here, he did not leave room for them to respond. He does not care whether they bowed down or not. He is going to have them bow down now. Hananiah and Mishael have the opportunity to bow down this second time and be saved. Maybe they were brave before. Maybe they stood up. But now attention is all on them. And he's going to have them bow down now. Another thing I want you to notice is the use of their Chaldean names. So Hananiah means God has favored. And his name was changed to Shadrach, which is the great scribe. Mishael, who is what God is, changed to Meshach, guest of a king. Azariah, Jehovah has helped, changed to Abednego, servant of Nebo, the pagan god, the namesake of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar uses these names, and they are harshly reminded of who they are. Nebuchadnezzar is essentially saying, scribe, guest, and servant of my pagan god. Who is the God who can rescue you from my power? So Nebuchadnezzar remembers what had happened before. He knows their participation in the story and their prayer, and he knows that God was faithful to them and revealed what he did not know. The ancient Near East mindset at this point is that there's regional gods. That our God is better than your God because our God allowed us to conquer you. And so they believe that there are these other gods. Nebuchadnezzar believes that there is a Jewish God. He thinks he's a Jewish God who reveals truths, but a Jewish God who is weak and incapable of saving his people. So he says, scribe, guest, and servant of my pagan God, who is the God who can rescue you from my power? Nobody will be able to stop me from throwing you in this furnace if you do not bow down now. And then we have their response in 16 through 18. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to give you an answer to this question. I'm going to pause real quick. I don't know if you heard me before. This is the most powerful king in the world at this point. He's got a giant furnace that just made this giant golden statue that's ready to slay them at any second. Their people have already been murdered, raped, and taken into captivity by the Babylonians. They have no power over him. And their response is, Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to give you an answer to this question. If the God we serve exists, then he can rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire. And he can rescue us from the power of you, the king. This may date me a little bit or show my age, but this reminds me of all those memes on the internet where somebody says something jaw-dropping and you see it clips to a bunch of guys just jumping backward going, oh. Like this is the part where the sports horn goes off. Bow, 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 bow. Like this is an amazing, faithful response that completely shuts the king down. And in verse 18, but even if he does not rescue us, we want you to know as king, we want you as king to know that we will not serve your gods or worship the gold statue you set up. What a response. We don't need to answer this question. Why answer the question when God will just show you the answer? This is insane. Our God will prove himself to you. And I'm sure Nebuchadnezzar is immediately thinking of their screams in the fire as they beg for mercy, the satisfaction that he's going to get from that. And they, without hearing his response, assume that thought and say in verse 18 again, but even if he does not rescue us, know that we would rather be thrown into the fire by your hand than bow down to your false image. Even if we are to die, we would rather die than be unfaithful to God. Why? Why? They have lost everything. They are under complete control of Babylon and have no hope of returning home. Why are they this bold? Why are they this hopeful? Where do they get this courage from? Let me tell you a secret. These three guys know the end of the story. Do we not think that Daniel shared with them the dream and the interpretation? Do you think they would want to be with the gold kingdom that will be destroyed? Or do they want to be with the everlasting kingdom that destroys the kingdom they're in now? These three know that the statue is going to be broken down into pieces and blown away with the wind. This is interpretation of the dream in Daniel 2:31 through 35. The head of the statue was pure gold, and its chest and arms were silver. Its stomach and thighs were bronze. Its legs were iron, and its feet were partly iron and partly filled fired clay. As you were watching, a stone broke off without a hand touching it, struck the statue on its feet of iron and fired clay, and crushed them. Then the iron and the fired clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were shattered, and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away, and not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Church, they know the ending. Why bow down to this temporary statue when a permanent one will replace it soon? Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were thinking in the long term. And unfortunately, too often we think in the short term. Our country is young. I don't even know my great-grandparents' names. Our culture thinks in the short term. And this is absolutely highlighted by the genocide of abortion in our country right now. This is why abortion is so high, because we think in the short term. It is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. Yes, this kid may be an inconvenience now, but you're missing out on the long-term blessing. People who have abortions, are they thinking of the smiles and hugs that their kid gives them? Of them calling for you and running to you when they get hurt? Are you thinking of the opportunity to lead them in family worship and see them coming to Christ and then fostering that long-term family discipleship? Are they thinking of the long-term impact they can have on the society around them? Are they thinking of the grandkids and great-grandkids that will love and cherish you and carry on the name of Christ from generation to generation? No. They think too often in the short term. And we are here as well, alongside them. With every sin, we think in the short term. It's about my personal satisfaction. It's about my convenience right now. It's about what's easy for me right now. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were not fools. They know the real consequence of their actions. They can die in a fiery furnace, most likely used to build the very statue that they refused to bow down to. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah know that this life is temporary, and they would much rather be a part of the mountain kingdom that will last forever, instead of the golden kingdom soon to be taken over by the silver, and then the bronze, and then the iron and clay, and soon to be taken over by God's kingdom. And church, we too know the ending to the story. We know that Christ's kingdom will never fail, and we know that the rock has come, and it has crushed the previous kingdoms, and that Nebuchadnezzar is dead, and that his gold statue no longer exists. And same with the Medo-Persians and the Greek and the Romans. In fact, we just celebrated recently the resurrection of Christ and the start of his mountain kingdom being built with every new believer. So let's go back to the narrative. Let's pick it up. Let's see what happens. Daniel 3:19 through 23. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with rage, and the expression on his face changed toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The Bible's saying if he was angry before, he's even angrier now. He gave orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than was customary, and he commanded some of the best soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. So these men, in their trousers, robes, and head coverings, and other clothes, were tied up and thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. Since the king's command was so urgent and the furnace extremely hot, the raging flames killed those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the furnace of blazing fire. Nebuchadnezzar is so filled with rage, and he has accepted the challenge. He will ensure that they will make it into the fiery furnace and that their God will not protect them. When it talks about 7 times hotter, 7 is the number of completion, so it may not have been exactly 7 times hotter, but it is as hot as they could possibly make it. And so there is no chance that if they are thrown in there, they won't burn up immediately. He has his best soldiers do the tying so that there is no chance their bounds will become unbound and they will escape and be free. Nebuchadnezzar is so filled with rage that he is willing to let his own men die to ensure that Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah will fall into the fire and that their God will be proven weak. In verse 24 and 25, then King Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in alarm. He said to his advisors, "Did we not throw 3 men bound into the fire?" And his advisors, "Yes, of course, your majesty." They replied to the king. He exclaimed, "Look, I see 4 men not tied, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Have you ever seen something so crazy you had to look to the person next to you and say, "Are you seeing this right now?" Imagine if a goat just opened up that door, walked up on the stage, and started playing the guitar. What Nebuchadnezzar is seeing is impossible. Something that would make you go, are you seeing this too? Is this a hallucination? This can't be real. And all of us should be really excited at this. There are now 4 untied men walking around the fire, completely fine. And Nebuchadnezzar loses the challenge. In verse 26 and 27, Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire and called, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you servants of the Most High God, come out." A little bit of a tone change there. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. When the satraps, prefects, governors, and the king's advisors gathered around, they saw that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men. Not a hair on their heads was singed. Their robes were unaffected, and there was no smell of fire on them. So his tone changes. You servants of the Most High God, instead of scribe, guest, and servant of my God. And all the leaders were there. All of Nebuchadnezzar's entire leadership team across his entire kingdom were there. And they saw that the fire had absolutely no effect on them, down to the hairs on their head and the smell of their clothes. Only Nebuchadnezzar's men were dead. Only his knots were burned away. And God's people were completely fine. 28 through 30. Nebuchadnezzar exclaimed, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel and rescued his servants who trusted in him. They violated the king's command and risked their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I issue a decree that anyone of any people, nation, or language who says anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be torn limb from limb and his house made a garbage dump. For there is no other God who is able to deliver like this." Then the king rewarded Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Their daily faithful actions of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah led to them laying it all on the line. This was not some momentary, abnormal action of theirs. This was not out of character for them. How can we as Christians expect to be faithful in the times that really matter when we are not faithful in the little things? I remember coming back from Dare to Share, and I remember lying on my homework and cheating on my tests. I remember not being faithful in the little things when I was so excited about what God has done for his people. And that is unfortunate. Their faithfulness to God was highly honored. And now God was honored by the king who thought he was weak. Now I have one last passage to help us connect their actions from the past to us today. It's from Hebrews, where the writer of Hebrews lays down several examples of faithfulness in the Bible, and we'll see a little nod to these three faithful men in chapter 30 or in verse 34. So it's Hebrews 11:32 through 12:2. And what more can I say? Time is too short for me to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, gained strength in weakness, became mighty in battle, and put foreign armies to flight. Women received their dead raised to life again. Other people were tortured, not accepting release, so that they might gain a better resurrection. Others experienced mockings and scourgings, as well as bonds and imprisonments. They were stoned, they were sawed in two, they died by the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, afflicted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and on mountains, hiding in caves and holes in the ground. All these were approved through their faith, but they did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, so that they would not be made perfect without us. And in 12:1, therefore, since we also have such a large cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every hindrance and the sin that so easily ensnares us. Let us run with endurance the race that lies before us, keeping our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy that lay before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. A few things that we can gather from this passage and the story of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They did not see the great statue get smashed. That would come after them. Yet they were still faithful to God in every aspect of their lives. Now we are on the other side of the rock. They saw a Christophany of Christ in the fire with them, but we saw Christ on the cross in our place. We get to see the mountain that is growing. And we are 2,000 years after that. We have seen the Christendom take over the world and Christ being shared in every nation. The mountain is growing with each new believer, and we are a part of the growing of God's kingdom with our little church here in Chattanooga going through revitalization. We have a cloud, a history of God follower after God follower, who, even though broken by sin, showcased faith time and time again in big things and in small things. We have their inspiring stories, true stories. These are not fake. This is not Hansel and Gretel. This really happened, where these three men were plunged into a fire that should have killed them, and they walked out not even smelling like smoke. We have this great cloud of witnesses around us, and they call and beg and plead for us to not give in to the gods of this world and to run this race with endurance. Each step we have in our life may seem monumental. We must share the love of Christ with those around us. We must be faithful in our work. We must live our lives in holiness, showing others that there is something other than self-gratification out there. And there is nothing compared to living holy, because our God is holy. We must have the courage to look at those that might have power over us, whether it's friends, bosses, children, or our culture, and say, no matter what you do, I will obey God. I will not give in to your demands. And even if God does not save me from the consequences of faithfulness in this life, we know he has saved us from the consequences of the next. Even if their mocking stings us and their furnaces take our lives, we have already been saved from this world into the loving arms of the Father. So I implore you, let us run the race alongside our fathers in the faith with endurance, who had not yet seen Christ, but knew that his kingdom would come and reign supreme. And we get to be on the other side of that, knowing who Christ is, knowing about his life, knowing about his actions, and with full assurance get to live our life in faithfulness to him. Please, live like the kingdom reigns supreme and all others have fallen away, because the kingdom does.